This is going to be my long overdue History of the Jedi video. This is by far my most requested video since I did History of the Sith a few months ago, and so I figured it was time to go ahead and get this out here before episode 7 to give everybody a good idea of where the Jedi came from and how they were established. Now, I don't normally talk about the quote-unquote good guys because,
now you see that evil will always triumph, because good is dumb.
But it is Star Wars, and I do like the Jedi, but it was just always weird growing up with toys as a kid. You had G.I. Joe, and you always pulled for Cobra because they had the cooler shit. Star Wars, you pulled for the Empire because they had the cooler toys. Even Transformers, you pulled for the Decepticons because they were cooler and they could fly versus just being cars. So I don't know what it is about the antagonists and all these stories and fantasy stuff that we love because the bad guys are always cooler. But I digress, so let's dive right into our light side friends and find out how they got started. So again, like in the History of the Sith video, we'll be going in a linear fashion to an extent here, and we're using the Star Wars dating system, which is BBY and ABY. And BBY is before the Battle of Yavin, and ABY is after the Battle of Yavin. The Battle of Yavin was the battle in Episode 4, A New Hope, where Luke helped destroy the first Death Star when he put away his nav computer and used the Force to guide 2 torpedoes into those pesky thermal exhaust ports. So let's jump right in. At 13 billion BBY, 13 billion years before the Battle of Yavin, the galaxy was formed. No, let's not go back that far. I'm kidding, but you actually literally could. There's so much information out there as far as the history and lore of Star Wars that you could dig into this stuff for days. So this is probably going to be a 2-part video, and we'll try to hit the most important points of the formation of the Jedi Order, how they came to be. But of course, there's obviously going to be a lot of information missing, although I'll go into some pretty good detail in those major events. So to set this up, I want to talk about a couple species real quick because they come into play later on, and I want to make sure it's kind of understood how these species help play a part in the formation and the creation of the Jedi. So we'll start around 100,000 BBY, 100,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. There was a species called the Qua. The Qua were described as a blue bipedal lizard-like species. They were approximately 3 meters tall, which is 9 feet, so damn, you got some basketball players there, that originated on their home world of Dathomir. Now, what's important about the Qua is that at this time in the galaxy, way before the Republic and way before the Jedi, they were already an advanced civilization that were force-sensitive and also had telepathic abilities. And they had this technology called an infinity gate. An infinity gate, you could think of it like as a Stargate. If you've seen the movie Stargate, you go in and you come out on some other planet somewhere across the galaxy. So they had this technology in the pre-hyperdrive era, and they used the Force to power this technology. And what the Qua did was go around searching out for other primitive life forms that were force sensitive, and they typically help those species develop their force abilities as well as help them technologically advance. Now what's important here is the Qua came across the planet Lihon using their infinity gate technology and came across a species called the Rakata that at the time was a primitive species, but they did sense that they were strong in the force. And as they had done so many times in the past, they helped the Rakata learn the force, and as they grew more powerful and knowledgeable in the force, they actually helped them technologically as well and helped them kind of come out of the Stone Age. The problem here is the Qua didn't understand that the Rakata were naturally adept to the dark side of the Force. I don't even know at this point if there was an understanding there were 2 sides to the Force. The Rakata were naturally adept to the dark side, and they would live to conquer and destroy other races. So to make a long story short, in the end they wanted to acquire this Infinity Gate technology, which the Qua had kept from them, and that comes into play a little bit later in our story. So we come up to the year 36,453 BBY, and by this time the Qua had spread through the galaxy and ended up on a planet called Tython. And at this point, the Rakata had already been after this Infinity Gate technology, and the Qua had already retreated to their homeworld of Dathomir, but some Qua stayed on the planet Tython, and they had died out by this point. But it was suspected that this Infinity Gate technology was actually on Tython. So oddly enough, in this same year, these 8 pyramid-style ships that were already scattered across the galaxy and essentially disabled, just sitting there, all of a sudden activated and started traveling throughout the galaxy, going to various worlds and calling out through the Force to all these Force-sensitive beings across the galaxy. These Throw-Your ships convinced Force-sensitive beings across these different worlds to board these ships and go on this pilgrimage. And through this journey of picking up Force-sensitive beings, they had picked up several species we're all familiar with, such as Wookiees, Twi'leks, Zabraks, humans, even the Sith species themselves. So then as they entered the deep core, they came to the planet Tython. So when they got to Tython, there was already a 9th ship there, so the arrival of the other 8 combined with the 9th brought in what was known as a force storm that swept across the entire planet of Tython. At this point, the 9 Throw-Your ships then scattered across the planet and came to their final destinations and dropped off their passengers. This event came to be known as the Thoyor arrival, and what happened was these ships then embedded themselves in the landscape in some cases, and in other cases they actually stayed hovering above the planet's surface. So all these Force sensitives that had been dropped off, who collectively became known as Tythons, then realized immediately that Tython was a planet that was very strong in the Force itself. The Pilgrims then realized that they were brought together to study the Force together on this planet of Tython, and quickly realized that it had something to do with balance. There were two satellite moons that orbited Tython. One was called Ashla and the other was called Bogan. So they came to realize really quickly that the Force had two sides to it, a light side and a dark side, which they called Ashla and Bogan, named after the two moons of Tython. With the realization that they were brought there to study the Force together, and discovering that the Force had two sides, the light side and the dark side, again called Ashla and Bogan, and they had to maintain balance, they quickly came together and formed what's called the Jedi Order. And they took the name Jedi from the Talid species of Dai Bindu monks, combining two words, the first being Je for mystic, and the word Dai meaning center. So the word Jedi means mystic center. So these pilgrims quickly realized that Tython was a thing of balance. So they maintained balance between the light side and the dark side. This was not good versus evil, and I think that's a big misconception in the Star Wars world due to the movies that portray the Sith as being evil, because Palpatine was an evil character. But the essential idea of light side and dark side are just polar opposites, duality. It doesn't mean, the light side is good and the dark side is bad. So these Tythons who formed this Jedi Order quickly realized that, and they physically had to maintain a balance because it was dangerous not to on the planet Tython, because Tython reacted violently when there was a slip of balance to one side or the other. So in the next 1,000 years, the Jedi built temples and cities and centers of learning and healing and that type of thing around these Thoyor ships that had embedded themselves in the landscape or stayed hovering across the landscape in some cases, and they built the first Jedi temples. So in the year 36019 BBY, the first Jedi temple was established, and it was called Padawan Kesh. Now, each of these temples, all 9 temples based around these Thoyor ships, were named something Kesh, and they all had different disciplines of study. And a Jedi named Nordia Drole was the first Jedi who became temple master of this Padawan Kesh. So for example, there was another temple which was the Temple of Healing called Mahara Kesh. So each of these had different disciplines, because all these pilgrims that came from all these different worlds were artisans, warriors, philosophers, scientists, etc. And that's how they came into the first Jedi ranks. Now, the ranks are a lot different from the Jedi Order that we know, as far as youngling, Padawan, Knight, Master, Grandmaster, etc. These were Padawan, where all young people, Force sensitive, went to study. Then they graduated to Journeyer, and a Journeyer was somebody who went on foot across the planet of Tython and visited all 9 of these temples and studied each discipline at each temple. Once mastery was gained through different disciplines and mastering the Force, they were moved up to the rank of Ranger. Now, the Ranger was sent out by the Jedi Council that they had established out through the local Tython system to help the established planets in the system with their affairs, etc. And this was the first time that the Jedi attached themselves to helping out other people or organizations off of the planet Tython. Now, once a Ranger had become sufficient enough, they could be moved up to the rank of Master or eventually Temple Master. Typically, there was one Temple Master, and that was the highest rank you could achieve, but there were some cases where there were co-Temple Masters. And it's also important to note here that not all their children that were born over the centuries were Force sensitive, and it became apparent that if you were not Force sensitive, you could not stay on this planet. It was physically dangerous if you were not able to touch the Force and contribute to the balance of the planet. So anybody that was not Force sensitive, even children, whether it broke up families or not, were sent away from the planet Tython to the other neighboring planets or the moons Ashla and Bogan, because they couldn't physically be there. Tython, again, was extremely reactive to imbalance in the Force. Also, during this time, they did create their first Jedi code, and as you can see here, the code is a good mixture of the modern day codes that we see from the Jedi Order and from the Sith Order. You can see this a combination of both, because at that time, again, it was all about balance. They recognized both the light side and the dark side. It was simply a balance that had to be maintained, because otherwise Tython would have destroyed them all. So then we come up to the year 35,000 BBY, and at this point the Rakatan Empire had been established, and these were the same Rakata species I spoke about earlier that the Kwa had helped out. They established what's called their Infinite Empire, and they started to spread out through the galaxy. And all their technology was powered by the dark side of the Force. Then we come up to the year 25805 BBY, and the first conflict arises between the Jedi Order and the other inhabitants of the Tython system, which encompassed all the non-Force users because they had been shipped off planet the entire time of the Jedi Order for thousands of years, as well as other people who were already there who were just not Force sensitive. So at this point in history, the Jedi had become a thing of legend on Tython, similar to Episode 7, The Force Awakens, and I think that'll tie in really well. We've seen now in the trailers that the Jedi, the dark side, etc. have all become a thing of legend, so someone by the name of Queen Hadia started the Despo Wars, but they were able to repel her and her forces and restore peace and balance to Tython once again. Now keep in mind that during this time there were no lightsabers. They used regular kind of katana-like swords, and these were imbued with the Force to make them stronger. So think of a regular sword versus a Valyrian steel sword for you ice and fire nerds. There were no lightsaber technology at this time, but that's about to change. So just 12 years later, in 25817 BBY, the Jedi experienced the first ship to come into their system on the planet Tython that had entered that system since the original Thoyor ships that brought their ancestors there. This was a crash that was discovered, and it threw Tython out of balance once again. And it was said that the Force storms that happened were that of equal magnitude to the original ones that happened during the arrival event where the Thoyor brought their ancestors. Now it's important to note here that a Jedi named Dagon Lok had had a vision of a fire blade that he had never seen before prior to this ship crashing. And the Jedi Masters and Council decided that this was some type of dark vision, that he was falling too close to the dark side, so he was banished to the moon of Bogon to meditate on the moon of Ashla, meditate on the light side of the Force to bring himself back into balance. But when the Jedi investigated this shipwreck, they found a lone survivor that was described as a mysterious man named Zesh, who carried a very mysterious weapon at the time called a Force Saber. Now this Zesh character ended up being what's called a Force Hound, and a Force Hound was essentially a Force-sensitive slave to the Rakatans who went out looking for other Force-sensitive worlds and species for them to conquer and get resources from. So Zesh was also captured and sent off to the moon of Bogon in exile because they wasn't sure who he was and what he carried. So Dagon Lok ran into Zesh and realized that this Force Saber he was carrying was the thing he had seen in his vision earlier on. So he found the Force Hound Zesh and asked him to build another one of these Force Sabers so he could take it to the Jedi Masters to show that his vision was in fact real. So obviously the Force Saber was the early technology that ended up being the prototypes of lightsabers that we know of today. But first we come up to the year 25,793 BBY, and this is when the Infant Empire, again the Rakatans, who were powered by the dark side of the Force, waged war against the Jedi Order. Now again, at this time the Jedi were fighting with regular swords just imbued by the Force, made stronger and sharper, etc. As the Rakata invaded the Tython system and waged war on the Jedi, again to try to acquire this Infinity Gate technology they believed to be on Tython from the original Qua, that some of these Jedi wanted to use these Force Sabers to arm themselves. The problem here was that to use these Force Sabers, you had to use the dark side of the Force, and any Jedi who wanted to use it took the risk of becoming more and more entrenched in the dark side as they used the Force Sabers. So during this Rakatan invasion, some of the Jedi wanted to use the Force Sabers to defend themselves, and others wanted to use their current regular sword weapons and not fall prey to the dark side. So that began a little rift there, and this is the first known rift between the light side and the dark side and people who wanted to use one or the other. So it could be said that this Force Saber coming into existence, which was Rakatan technology, was the catalyst that started this great divide between what we call now the light side and what we call the dark side. So that began what's called the Great Force Wars in the same year. We'll get into that in the next video in part 2, where we'll talk about the establishment of the Jedi Order and the Force Wars and on up through to the Jedi Order that we know of today. In the meantime, you can click here to check out my History of the Sith video that I did a few months ago, which kind of led to this video. And for you Ice and Fire nerds, you can click here on the last video I did on my last Game of Thrones Season 6 Q&A, where I answer several viewer questions as well as go into Bran's visions and explain kind of what they are in Book 5 of Dance with Dragons. Check that out. Let me know what you think. Be sure to subscribe to get everything. I'll try to get out part 2 as quick as I can. And in regards to this video, I want to know what you guys think. What do you think caused these original Thoyor ships to essentially activate themselves and go across the galaxy searching for Force-sensitive beings? So let me know what you think. Be sure to subscribe to get everything. Thanks for watching, you guys, and we'll see you in part 2.